Well, let's take you around the weekend housing markets just to see how robust they are right now. Now, clearly until Australian Day and when the kids get back to school next week, it's going to be pretty quiet. So across the country, there were just 256 auctions, and of those, a touch over 57% sold. Now, in Sydney, it was also super quiet, just 37 auctions. You can see here, just 54% of those were sold. In Melbourne, 78 auctions. Now, some weekends, remember, there have been more than 1,000 auctions in Melbourne, but 78 over the weekend, and 61.5% of those were sold. In Brisbane, 29 auctions, almost 83% of those were sold. In Adelaide, 26 auctions, and all but 3 of those were sold, so it's pretty healthy there. And in Canberra, 7 auctions, and 6 were sold. So let's bring in here Anne Flaherty, economist with REA Group, who joins us from Melbourne. And look, it's early in the year, but the forecasts right now, to me, seem to suggest that the price rises we saw in the capital city housing markets in the past 12 months are going to be pretty hard to replicate this year.
Yeah, we do think that price growth this year won't reach the same levels that we saw across much of the country last year. And I think what we've seen over the past 6 months in 2023 was that price growth was actually starting to slow down. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the first few months of the year. And I think a lot of what's going to impact property price growth is how many homes we see hit the market. We did see a bit of a pickup over the end of last year, but of course it's very quiet at the moment. So I think that pre-Easter selling season will be really interesting to watch in terms of if we see a lot of properties flood the market, we're likely to see slower price growth.
We've always talked about the link between housing prices and employment prospects, and that's going to be one of the keys. You could see with the unemployment rate last week at 3.9%, that was steady, still very strong. But against that, there was also some suggestion that there are an increasing number of workers being let go. So, that is where there's just a question mark about how people feel about their job, the stability of that.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people have been doing it tough for a really long time. The 2 pandemic years, actually, household savings were really high, and we had that period give a lot of people a buffer for a long time. But we've been steadily seeing the household savings rate drop. And actually in September last year, we saw the savings rate fall to the lowest level since December 2007, when the global financial crisis was kicking off. So there's no question that people are really doing it very difficult at the moment.
Okay, so then it takes me to another aspect. When people are feeling prosperous, when people are feeling well, they generally go and look for a second or maybe a third property. And in many areas, especially during the pandemic when people couldn't travel, that was some of the more desirable parts of Australia's tourism markets, the Mornington Peninsula, Byron Bay, and also the Sunshine Coast on the East Coast. But there were plenty of other places in Western Australia and South Australia besides. But what's happened to those markets subsequently?
Yeah, well, we saw some extraordinary price growth in those lifestyle suburbs. So Byron Bay is your classic example of that. The Mornington Peninsula in Melbourne, prices grew very, very rapidly during those years. And we saw there was such strong competition that buyers were just bidding up those prices to be successful. We've now really seen price growth in those regions reverse in some cases and certainly slow. What we're seeing there is a real price correction. Having said that, when we compare prices in those areas to where they were sitting back in March 2020, so those pre-pandemic levels, even though we have seen a bit of a price correction in some of those areas, they still overall have seen extraordinary price growth over the past 3.5 years.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because there almost seemed to be something of a luxury. People were able to justify it by virtue of not being able to travel overseas. Now in the cold, hard light of day, it's a situation where people do have choices to where they travel. And now that's a part of the reason why maybe there's not as many people looking at those property markets.
Well, look, certainly with interest rates as high as they are, it's more difficult for people who are considering purchasing a second home. We're also seeing some taxes, particularly, in Victoria, for example, where there are now tax penalties for purchasing a second home. But I think that the fact that we've had 13 interest rate rises coming off a period when interest rates were at record low levels, which gave people a lot of capacity to buy those second homes in those lifestyle areas, we've really now seen that dynamic shift. So certainly we're not seeing that same level of growth in demand for those lifestyle suburbs that we were seeing back a couple of years ago.
I'll tell you what, Anne Flaherty, always good to have you in the program, and many thanks for your time today.
Thank you for having me.